such a large crowd of supporters at what promises to be a very interesting evening. Our speaker tonight, as you obviously know since you're here, is Professor Alexei Muravyev from Curtin University in Western Australia, an expert on maritime security issues, an expert on Russia, on what we used to call Eastern Europe, and in particular on all the current issues that are arising out of the Ukraine warfare. Professor Muravyev made a number of addresses to our sister branch in Victoria and was telling me that he's been invited to return there again shortly. But meanwhile, he's going to talk to us tonight about the relationship between Russia's war in Ukraine and the risk of offensives in the Baltic. I'll say no more because that's going to be over to him, but he's got the usual half hour for an address to us, following which questions and discussion. Professor Muravyev.
Thanks very much and good evening to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Sorry, I decided to go for even more dramatic effect besides the title of my presentation. That's why I'm speaking to you with my husky voice. I picked up something on en route to Sydney. It's my first time, maybe last time after what I'll do tonight here, but thanks very much for coming, one way or another. Before I start, first of all, I would like to acknowledge traditional custodians on the lands on which we meet, pay my respects to their elders and leaders past, present, and emerging, recognizing that this land has always been of indigenous Australians. Also, as a disclaimer that I'm speaking here in my private capacity and my remarks and my views should not be attributed either to my institution or government departments or organizations I may have affiliation with. One of the reasons why I proposed to Ian to do the talk is not just because of what's happening in Europe, but also because of what's been observed for quite some time with respect to that part of the world. And you may be thinking, well, how does this relate to us whilst we've been on the other side? But it seems like there is like a Nordic week happening in Australia this particular week. I think there is a similar presentation that is taking place in ACT, also on Northern Europe, and the Czech president is speaking in town tonight, and I'll be really surprised if he talk about Fiji or other places. So I think what the conversation that we're having tonight actually aligns with the overall theme by incident, not by purpose, of what's being discussed here as well. And certainly the developments over the past few weeks, which in the first instance obviously affect Europe's geostrategic landscape, the escalation phase and the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, the decision to give the Ukrainian military permission to use medium-range tactical missiles to hit targets inside Russia's internationally recognized territory, and Russia's subsequent response with the test firing of the new RBM, and then media frenzy about what it might mean for the rest of Europe. And last thing I read earlier this morning, that the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs suggests that this type of system may also be deployed in Asian part of Russia in response to whatever they may perceive the United States and its allies will be doing here. So by default, there is a Pacific connection occurring in a sense, but the escalation ladder that continues to be apparently climbed with regards to the ongoing war in Ukraine does not exclude that Europe may see the expansion of an open confrontation in other areas. And certainly for a long time, the Baltics have been considered to be one of those areas of potential contest. And that kind of brings me back and have a bit of a memory flashback, because back in 2019, I was asked to take part in a research project concerning scenario development for Lithuania in case if there's going to be a military confrontation between Russia and Lithuania. Again, reminding you, I'm talking about the year 2019. The project was completed over the year 2020 with a future-driven scenario based on what might have happened in the year 2021, so the year before Russia invaded Ukraine. So without going, it's a very long project and some issues I'm not prepared to share, but the plot of the project was that the invasion of Lithuania was that allegedly, again, I'm talking about the scenario here, not something that was supposed to take in real life, was supposed to take place in November 2021. Obviously, that was, as I said, future forecasting from the year 2019-2020. After the Russians used effectively an excuse when they accused the Lithuanian authorities of being responsible for the catastrophe that saw the loss of life of senior Russian officials when the aircraft sustained plunged upon descent into Russia's Kaliningrad exclave, just shortly leaving Lithuanian airspace. Again, I'm skipping through the details of that, even though Lithuania denied any involvement. The Kremlin effectively authorized the massing of its forces. They ran joint exercises with its closest ally, Belarus. And in mid-November, 3 weeks after the escalation phase moved into the preparation phase, the Russian forces invaded. According to the scenario that we came up with, it took about 72 hours for them to secure the bulk of the country. Organized resistance was overpowered. NATO elements that were stationed in Lithuania were effectively escorted out of Lithuania, and then the Lithuanian military and paramilitaries, as well as civilians that chosen to resist, resorted to guerrilla-style warfare. Some may say from the point of 2022 or the year 2024, it's unrealistic. It's not going to happen. And certainly the dynamics, the power dynamics between Russia and NATO would be considered to be different in terms of NATO negotiating something with the Russians. But we need to remember that certainly before the war in Ukraine, which proved to be a major test to Russia's capacity to fight, to NATO's capacity to fight and defend, leave alone Ukraine. Similar scenarios were developed with respect to the majority of the Baltic countries. RAND Corporation ran a similar scenario vis-a-vis Estonia, and their assessment was very much similar in terms of the time frame and the outcome. Having said that, we need to remember that prior to the invasion of Ukraine, no one was giving the Ukrainians any credit, and even Pentagon assessments suggested that Kyiv would be taken within 96 hours and the war would come to an end within 3 weeks. A similar scenario was actually entertained in the Kremlin, so in this sense, Washington and Moscow was on the same page in terms of not recognizing that Ukrainians can actually fight and resist, and then everyone went through this Kinder Surprise phase to an extent. But again, that was back in 2021, the scenario which was developed on our analysis back in 2019, 2020. Now we're in the year trying to use something that doesn't work. Late 2024. We need to remember that the war in Ukraine is on 1,005th day, as it is today. I don't think anyone envisaged that. So in terms of scenario planning and plotting and trying to work out who is having the upper hand, we failed before, we continue to fail again. So never say never, as one of the movies suggests. So returning back to the Baltics, because the Baltics has actually, and the situation in Ukraine, I think only increases the angst and the anxiety that is happening vis-à-vis Baltic region security, and certainly any suggestions that Russia's preoccupation with the war fighting in Ukraine somehow eases operational pressure on other regions, I think it's a bit optimistic in this sense. So again, I'm very mindful of the time frame that is set up for me, so I'm happy to take questions if you want more details. So I just want to highlight a couple of escalation points, which in my view, in my assessment, may create a trigger point for the escalation of the situation from standoff into something a bit more serious and dramatic. First of all, it's important to remember that the Baltic Sea region, when we talk about the Baltics, we should obviously be thinking about the region, which is predominantly maritime, has a long history of geopolitical and geostrategic contest that goes back to about 12th, 13th century, and certainly evolving Russia back then. So the standoff that we may be talking about now has long history, long roots, and certainly long historical memories involving all the sides. It's a pretty tight area, so the space of geopolitical maneuvering that can be we can indulge here in the Pacific is non-available over there. It's way too tight, and if we recall a situation, say late 2010s with aircraft intercepts and near misses and yes, well, an illustration to what we're talking about. Things can happen at any time. It actually has been a bit of a walking on that knife's edge for quite some time. And certainly the contest for the maritime domain is really pivotal towards understanding what may actually be the trigger point behind this. From Russia's perspective, even though the Russians have not been as dramatic about seeing the Baltic states joining the EU and NATO back in 2004, as certainly they acted concerning Ukraine, and Ukraine obviously hasn't joined anything yet. Nonetheless, it did affect Russia's strategic calculus, including the assessments made by the Russian General Staff on a number of factors. One is the Baltic states have never been signatories to the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. That's what CFE stands for, meaning that there are technically no limitations on how much military equipment one can store on NATO's northeastern flank. And same applies to Russia as well to some extent. So that's a gray zone that can be exploited in one way or another. Secondly, the expansion of NATO infrastructure into the Baltics creates a situation when Russia began reliving deja vu, or something I'll refer to later on, initially with, for example, Estonia becoming part of NATO, and NATO aircraft based in forward bases in Estonia would be 12-15 minutes flight from St. Petersburg and other strategic centers of gravity in Moscow, so in Russia, so clearly it creates a sense of angst. Just like the complete surrounding of Kaliningrad enclave, even though I prefer to refer to it as exclave because it's completely separated from Russia's mainland and encircled by NATO, and that in itself creates a situation when, on one hand, the Russians feel very paranoid about not being able to connect by secure links, but their military buildup creates obviously a sense of concern and even paranoia with neighbors, and that was quite evident with regards to how this military buildup was interpreted prior to the invasion of Ukraine, especially with regards to the armored or tank element. And there are territorial disputes that continue to exist and have been accelerated specifically with respect to Russia and Estonia, where there have been claims made on the ownership of border regions, and obviously territorial disputes can create trigger points. The forward stationing of NATO forces obviously have been considered to be another big element of concern for the Russians, and obviously their stationing have been justified on the basis that the Baltic states feel insecure about having such a massive neighbor with a massive military on its doorstep, because the combined military strength of the Baltic states is equivalent to about roughly one standard army division, which is obviously incredibly moderate, put it in incredibly delicate terms, to protect the territory of three states. However, that may not be the only reasons why things can go pear-shaped. You see flames on the screen? Mm-hmm. This is where I believe, or they kind of indicative of potential areas which may actually inflate real flame of the conflict. And that needs to be understood, and I'll speak more about each of them very shortly. But once again, reminding you that we're in the year 2024, and for those who may have skeptical views on what are you talking about, Russia has no means, or has no capacity to do anything in the Baltics because it's not doing well in the war in Ukraine. Well, we can have a conversation about that, but a couple of things that needs to be taken into account. Simple thing is, if the Russians want to do something in this space, we need to remember that the bulk of the Russian Navy remains inactive. It's not very involved in the work, so they have assets that they can commit. Half of the Russian Air Force can still be made available for other contingencies, because whilst the Russians fighting in Ukraine, they continue to have run operations in Syria as well. And right now, they're actually quite busy in our neighborhood as well. Plus, they adjusting the organizational structure of their military. By the end of the year, the standing strength of the Russian military will go up to 1.5 million. They have reinstated Leningrad military district with a specific purpose to engage in operational activities, defensive and offensive, on Russia's northwestern flank, specifically vis-a-vis the Baltics and Finland, plus Norway. Before, it was responsibility of a much larger Moscow military district. Now it's all been redistributed. So the way how the thinking in Moscow goes is very specific and far more targeted with regards to the Baltic Sea region than before. So what are these trigger points, and why there may be trouble over them? One is something that has been discussed quite regularly, the so-called Suwalki Gap, the shortest territorial strip that separates Kaliningrad exclave from Russia's ally Belarus. Again, from the military logic, if you want to sustain any form of activity, you need to have a logistical corridor to support your forces. So if the Russians want to establish land-based corridor, which in theory should be more secure, that maritime corridor, that's obviously the quickest way to go, but the quickest doesn't necessarily mean the easiest. But it's not to say that even though NATO has been preparing for it, there have been exercises run in Poland, also concerning potential defense of the Suwalki Gap. One exercise still demonstrated, which was done, I think, either last year or in 2022, that NATO would still find difficult dealing with the Russians over defending the Suwalki Gap. Not to say that it's impossible, but it wasn't considered to be an easy job done, even though the Russians at that time were not doing really well in the Ukraine. So if push comes to shove, the Russians may still want to bulldoze it through, but that means involving Belarus in the war fighting in one way or another. And right now, I think Belarusians are quite reluctant of committing to anything that would get them on the front line, despite the rhetoric from its president, Lukashenko. Again, as you see here, what is the problem for NATO? What is the problem for the Russians? and as well as the advantages. One of the advantages for the Russians to still choose to go through the corridor is that would physically separate the Baltics from the main sphere of influence and operations of NATO, and that would place the Baltics even more vulnerable position apart from connecting Kaliningrad with Belarus. So there may be some incentives for the Russians to go if they want to go all the way and no strings attached. However, I would not be still considering that to be the primary area of concern. My concern is now more with what's happening in the Gulf of Finland, because this is where Moscow may feel like they're returning back to the scenario of 2018, a year after the Bolshevik Revolution, when Finland became independent, when the Baltic states became independent, or the year 1939, the year which saw the Soviet Union engaged in the Winter War, the invasion of Finland. And that was done on the basis of Russia feeling strategically vulnerable with regards to, first of all, maritime access, because the Gulf of Finland, by virtue of its geography, is icebound for half a year. It's incredibly narrow, incredibly difficult to navigate. Why am I placing an emphasis on that? Because one of the reasons why Russia in Kaliningrad, it's ice-free. It allows Russia, subject to all the normal situation, trade with Europe, with other parts of the world. But currently, this situation is conditional because there are restrictions on the movements of commodities via Lithuania, for example. So the bulk of Russian transit via the Baltic maritime domain is happening through ports that the Russians were building over the past decade around St. Petersburg. And given the fact that Finland is now part of NATO, and there's been conversation on how NATO may operationalize restraints on Russia's maritime movement, that, in my view, may actually trigger more points because they feel like it's a bottleneck for them and potentially becoming a chicken neck. As a result, they've been deploying surface-to-surface missiles in the area and building up military presence, even though they're heavily committed to the ongoing war in Ukraine. So if anything, I would probably say that's the area where that may actually trigger an outbreak of activities, also because of the historical precedent. When the Soviets felt vulnerable with regards to Finnish border being too close to Leningrad, what they've done, they invaded Finland to push the defenses back. And we can talk about situation during the Soviet Civil War, et cetera, et cetera. So the Gulf of Finland was always considered to be quite sensitive in terms of history of Russia's defenses in that part of the region. So what are the key takeaway points? Well, I'm no reporter for Daily Mail, so I'm not going to place my bets on whether the year 2044 is the year when it's all going to happen, but you never know. Daily Mail writes about lots of things. I prefer to write for Sky News, but that's my choice. But the fact that scenarios continue to be entertained about that part of the world and how it may look like, again, I always enjoy reading people's scenarios, just like I enjoy drafting my own scenarios, also bearing in mind that if you draft scenarios on somebody else's behavior, it's not does not necessarily mean that they would follow your script. They would probably write their script. But from the viewpoint of 2024, no one is dismissing nothing with regards to possible escalation in the Baltic or over the Baltic, even though we still have an unresolved situation in Ukraine. And there are broader considerations, and I want to leave you with that. Can this conflict be avoided? Yes, I'm not going to suggest to you by any accounts that we're dealing with one-way road. There is always an opportunity to resolve, including of the fear of an all-out war. Taking you back to the slide that I started my presentation with, the escalation ladder, the combat deployment of missile technology, including intermediate range missile technology that hasn't been operationalized in combat environment before, still puts brakes on ruling elites' thinking and the decision making. I'm not saying that these brakes cannot be lifted. There are so many lines that's been crossed in the war in Ukraine. No one seems to be willing to slow these things down, but there is still kind of an overall fear that we don't want to see the repetition of certain Cold War scenarios that were entertained during the Cold War, when war games in Europe suggested that any conventional conflict and 80% chances would escalate to a full-out nuclear war. But that sort of rational thinking and sort of naive logic runs against a counter narrative that we're dealing in a situation, we live in a situation of strategic paranoia. Paranoia that certainly drives Russia's behavior, paranoia that clearly exists in Europe as well, when they continue to talk about Russia, going in and taking more if it's going to win over Ukraine. There is clear lack of political will to step down and discuss. I cannot possibly see, even though German Chancellor Scholz called Putin and French President Macron chased Russia's Minister Lavrov to shake his hand in G20 summit. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is will to start having conversations, especially face-to-face conversations. And when there is lack of appetite or will or trust to have these conversations whilst you're still pushing the trigger, it's ain't looking good. And you need to have political courage to do that, and I don't really see that there is political courage, and I don't think anyone actually has too much hope about Trump's promise to fix the war with one phone call or, in one day. So we're in the gray zone here. In theory, this thing can be negotiated and resolved. In practice, no one is willing to take the first step forward. While you haven't had an experience with me, I go with a notorious reputation on making people feel depressed with my presentation, so I'm not sure how well I have done my job here. But anyway, thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Alexei. We now have a good half hour for questions and comments, and hopefully no conflict. Who'd like to start? Please wait for the intern with the microphone reaching.
John Hallam, and I'm nuclear weapons campaigner with People for Nuclear Disarmament.
Are you pro or anti?
Well, obviously anti. First of all, what you've said is very much coincident with my own point of view, and as for making people depressed, I think we can have a competition over that any day. What scenarios do you see that might be able to de-escalate and lead us out of what's going on at the moment? And what scenarios do you see that might lead to an event sequence that would terminate civilization?
Sorry, can you repeat the second part?
What scenarios do you see that might lead to an event sequence that would terminate civilization? 1983, here we come again. Actually, I think we're in a more dangerous situation than we were back in 83.
Do people remember 1983?
No, too young.
No, I just want to make sure that people are on the same page about what we're talking about. All right.
Able Archer, the Colonel Stan Petrov crushed with the apocalypse.
Okay. Again, I'm going through the coding for you. So Able Archer, it was one of NATO's largest exercises that involved the simulated deployment of nuclear weapons, and it got so real that Soviet General Staff began considering it as the preparation phase for the actual use of lethal power against the Soviet Union, so they went on full alert. It also, 1983 was the time when the Soviet Air Force downed Korean Airlines flight, incidentally 007, over the Sea of Okhotsk, which created a massive outcry because there was massive loss of civilian life. And that was also the year when Russian early warning system mistakenly identified some Blixorb. There was a computer glitch that set automatic system on full alert, assuming that the Soviet Union was under the missile attack, and it came down to one person to not execute the executive order, for which he was initially punished, but later on not fully rehabilitated, but I think he was almost like given some sort of a recognition for not really triggering the war on the basis of mistaken identity. Whether we're now living in the situation of 1983, I would probably say we're in the situation of 1961, the year before Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, Cuban Missile Crisis did not, and I just had a conversation with interns here, so they would hear it for the second time, did not start when the Soviet missiles landed on Cuba. They started when US missiles were deployed in Turkey and in Italy. And that triggered the reaction. In terms of what would get people to start thinking rationally, to translate the first part of the question, well, in terms of trying to get ruling elites on all sides to realize that things are really serious, they need to realize that there are people in the world that are not bluffing. I think a lot that's been happening, including with that slide that I started to show, it's still been interpreted as a form of bluff, that Putin will go to a certain point, but he's not going to go all the way. And I think that in itself creates a bit of a problem, because we cannot 100% be certain that we read the behavior of the other side correctly. Sometimes we apply our own thinking and our own model of behavior on the other side, but their psychology, their rule of thumb, their decision-making processes may be completely different, even if they look very similar. What may trigger a change of mind? One of the scenarios I know the Russians are entertaining is the resumption of nuclear testing. So if they will blow up something, that may kind of give another signal. Whether that would still be convincing enough, no one knows, because I think there is still, we still kind of stuck in this comfort zone of bluff. One of the reasons why, and this is what I normally tell my students, one of the reasons why we have problems in the world right now is the ruling elites today are fundamentally different from ruling elites of the Cold War era. And what makes them distinct is during the Cold War, the ruling elite in Washington, in Europe, and in the Soviet Union were veterans of the Second World War. They saw action, they saw destruction. And that's what got Kennedy and Khrushchev to talk to one another, not because they had different channels of communication, including through intelligence services, but because they imposed self-restraint on their behavior, knowing that if they saw what conventional weaponry could do 20 plus something years prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis, they could have certainly understood what nuclear weapons could do. For modern elites right now, that the threat of a nuclear war or any form of world war is considered more like a simulation. And that creates, and okay, I can ask how many commanders-in-chief in developed countries actually have done national service or actually know anything about the military, and they're the ones who are responsible for leading troops in battle. And if you have no clue about the organization you're supposed to give orders to, well, what are the chances you provide them with accurate guidance or advice? So that in itself, to me, is a big problem. So, but how far do you want to push with unconvincing them that bluff should not really be entertained when nuclear weapons are in place. I don't know. And I prefer to deal with scenarios that look more realistic to me. So nuclear test is something I can see occurring. Anything beyond that, well, watch Terminator 2.
Next cheerful question.
Scenario. Trump solves the battle. Russia gets the eastern provinces of Ukraine. Putin claims victory. Putin has now got Finland, Estonia, Sweden, all now part of NATO, and a promise that Ukraine will become part of NATO. Who is the actual winner?
All right, I can give you an answer as the citizen of the world. The answer would be the world, because that kind of gives us a pause, not necessarily, it's not going to give a resolution, put it this way. It's going to give an operational pause and ease the pressure on the finger that it sits on sits comfortably on the red button. And that may create, I don't want to sound like, you know, a script writer for the Star Wars, you know, there is another hope. That may give some sort of a breathing space for people to start talking to one another. Because right now, the key challenge that I see, we need to suspend fighting. Because if we go all the way, we continue with the current trajectory. Already we're in a situation, if we're talking about the war in Ukraine, we're in a situation of the war of attrition. And Russia has the upper hand. There is no second doubt about that. I'm sorry if someone may disagree with me, that's my opinion. In the current situation, in the war in Ukraine, and the war is actually the war of attrition, Russia has the upper hand. Yeah, but Russia cannot fight this war forever. Putin cannot fight this war forever. So there should be some sort of a, you know, Rubicon. I don't want to call it the red line or the green line. As I said, you know, I think both sides ran out of red ink and blue ink, drawing these endless lines that no one respects. But again, it's not for Putin to make a call. It's all the parties involved in the conflict, and it's not a two-side conflict. So that gets things more complicated. The situation with Finland and the Baltic states is not going to ease, even if hostilities will cease in Ukraine because of the scenario I gave you here. Russia's strategic paranoia is not going to go away anytime soon. In fact, Putin will have more resources redirected to that. And if Putin will claim victory, because yes, I can easily see how he can say, we follow the provision of the, don't make me do the Russian accent, because the fake accent that I hear on television, my throat hurts trying to impersonate it. We follow the provision of the Constitution. These regions are ours. We liberated them, so we set what we achieved our goals. So Kyiv is not going to go to the Russians simply say, oh, sorry guys, you know, I'll let you down. I promised you more, but that's as far as I could deliver. What it means is Russia is mobilized. The population is mobilized, the economy is semi-mobilized. So for him to redirect that energy somewhere else is not going to be much of a challenge. And if the United States and NATO will accept Russia's control over 20 plus something % of the Ukrainian territory, how Western elites will take it? How are they going to explain to their taxpayers and to their people that? Because what was the narrative that was coming out of Brussels and Washington, here in Canberra? Well, not here, close. we need to ensure that Russia sustains strategic defeat. Telling the Ukrainians to give parts of their territory to the Russians would be a very difficult pill to swallow in terms of simply saying how that actually matches your initial strategic objective. So what it means, Putin may actually be encouraged to exercise or flex more muscles with regards to the Baltics. Because again, Baltics are now Ukrainians. No offense to anyone who may actually have roots in the Baltics, but they don't have the means to resist. And then we would run into the ambiguous situation once again, whether NATO would actually be fully committed to defend the Baltics, even though they're part of their sphere of influence and fall under their operational requirement, dealing with nuclear-armed Russia. So there are too many unknowns and uncertainties, and when there are gray zones, it only increases not only ambiguity, but risks of this ambiguity being exploited.
I see many
Okay.
hands.
I should stop giving long answers because I think it triggers more questions.
If I may, without opening the door for you for another long answer, although they're fantastic, two questions really. I was recently in Georgia and Tbilisi and looking at the NATO flags flying proudly around the city, and certainly talking to the tour guide and some of the other individuals we ran into about the concerns over where this is all going to lead for a country like that. The second, quite separate question is, can Trump make it worse by acting, which I believe he's forced to do something because he said he's going to do it, and his ego is in the way of him not recognising the opportunity to step back.
Can Trump, I'll start with the second question. Can Trump make it worse? Yes, he can. We need to remember that whilst Trump may have, massive affinity for Putin as the person, and yes, they seem to get along quite well, doesn't necessarily mean he is going to do any trade-offs. Because he had meeting with Putin, I'm talking about his first presidency, and a couple of months later he orders cruise missile strikes on targets in Syria, which really placed some of the target zones very close to where the Russians were stationed. So, and he began providing Ukraine with initial batch of military equipment whilst he was in the office. Even though when he was in the office, Ukraine stopped being international news. I mean, I try to remind people that Ukraine was the frontline news in the year 2014 and 2015, and certainly after MH17 tragedy. Trump comes in the office 2016, because I work with media so I can monitor the space. By 2017, Ukraine stopped being not only the frontline news, but secondary line news. So because he has no interest in it. But can he do something? Yeah, he can. And obviously the team that he is assembling right now is very unconventional. How they're going to manage, I'm not really sure, because we need to remember Ukraine is not just his not priority. He's got other things he needs to talk to Vlad about. Strategic nuclear arms stability conversation that has been effectively frozen. Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, medium range treaty from which he pulled out, and obviously that would now be kind of probably revisited after the Russians tested their new RIBM. If he wants to talk about Russia-China relationship, he needs to have something to offer to Vladimir if he wants to divorce his bromance from Xi Jinping, or disrupt his bromance. But if he's not going to get his way, well, again, he's not a system person, so he can improvise. And I think that's why the Russians kind of feel that he is a more risky factor than anyone from the Democratic Party. So yeah, it's another gray zone. In terms of Georgia, yes, I also saw NATO flags there and EU flags and everything else. Would it mean, in terms of Georgia changing strategic course? I'm not 100% sure. I haven't seen any real commitment either from the Europeans or the Americans towards Georgia. And I think the Georgian elite realizes that it's not going to be left with Russia on its own for the second time. They lost a significant part of their territory. Russian tanks were on Tbilisi's doorstep back in August 28, 6 days into the conflict. I don't think they have the will to re-engage, and that's why Georgia was resisting to open the second front since 2022. But never say never, as I said before. Excuse me.
Thank you. How should we regard Russia's motives in the invasion of Ukraine and what you may describe as threats to the Baltics? Is it the movement of NATO to its borders, essentially, or is it imperial ambitions?
Do we have another kind of couple of hours? Or did people bring, camp banks or something so we can camp out for the night?
I'm sure you can do it in 3 minutes.
Look, Nate, and again, I'm sort of repeating the question that I was asked just a bit earlier. No, NATO is not the sole reason. One of the reasons, and that's my personal take, is the Russians feel frustrated with themselves because they kind of naturally assume that Ukraine will always be within their sphere of influence. They did nothing there. Since 1991, they did nothing there. They didn't work with Ukraine. If they wanted Ukraine to be part of it, they just, they haven't worked with this, and all of a sudden then they kind of jump one morning thinking, well, look, what's going on, you don't like us anymore? That's not okay. That's more of a kind of anecdotal level. Coming back to Georgia in 2008 was the first time when the Russian and Ukrainian forces clashed, because the Ukrainians sent their air defense crews to sideline with Georgia. So the first shots were not fired on 24th January 2022. They were fired on whatever was the date, 8 August 2008. So there was a build-up of tension for quite some time. Crimea was a big sticking point, obviously, but in very short answer, yes, Putin's kind of hypothesis that if NATO is to establish defense infrastructure in Ukraine, and then Moscow will be within short striking distance from missiles that may be fired from Kharkiv region, is a deja vu back to 1961 situation. But it was done on the assumption, what if? And that's what I call a case of strategic paranoia. You take action, you take decisive action on the basis of a hypothesis that you run, not on the basis of response to something that was actually happening. But that wouldn't be the sole factor. Again, a combination of factors, but we need 2 or 3 hours for me to go into detail.